Lesson 35, the impact of World War II on Americans. What kinds of opportunities and hardships did the war create for Americans at home and abroad? Introduction. After the shocking Pearl Harbor attack, Americans worried about what might happen next. Would waves of Japanese bombers strike the West Coast? Rumors of enemy invasion haunted coastal communities for months. The fears faded in time, but the region remained wary. As it turns out, the United States was not immediately endangered by enemy invasion, yet as President Franklin Roosevelt warned, the threat was real. If the Allies failed to stop the Axis powers, Americans could face the horrors of war on their own shores. Roosevelt understood the war efforts would require enthusiastic support from American people in order to succeed. Millions of Americans would be needed to serve in the armed forces, while many others would have to help on the home front by increasing the output of war materials. Everyone would have to make sacrifices to support the armed forces. They would have to accept rationing, a system for limiting the distribution of food, gasoline, and other goods so that the military could have the weapons and equipment and supplies it required. As a result, life in the United States would soon transform dramatically. These changes were evident in numerous ways, including clothing styles. The armed forces needed fabric for uniforms, so in March of 1942, the government announced rationing rules that would save over 40 million pounds of wool a year. Men's suits would no longer be sold with a vest or an extra pair of pants. Cuffs were eliminated, as were patch pockets and wide lapels. These rules also restricted the type and amount of fabric in women's clothing, so designers cooperated by using synthetics like rayon and by making skirts shorter and dresses simpler. The entire country would endure hardships during the war that extended far beyond the wearing of plainer clothes. Yet the war would also offer new opportunities to countless Americans. Organizing the American economy for war. The responsibility of organizing the wartime economy fell into the War Production Board, WPB, which sought to achieve Roosevelt's goal of making the United States the arsenal of democracy. Like the War Industries Board of World War I, the WPB's primary task was to manage converting industries to military production. Some of these transformations were simple. Automobile manufacturers, for example, shifted from making car engines to building airplanes and tank engines. Other conversions called for more dramatic changes. A soft drink company might reconfigure its machinery and retrain its workers to pack artillery shells with explosives, while the making of model trains might begin producing bomb fuses. Model trains might start making bomb fuses. Across the country, businesses mobilized their resources to serve the military's needs. A wartime production boom ends the Depression. The pressing demand for military supplies revived the economy, effectively ending the Depression. Businesses expanded and hired more workers, and farmers prospered as crop prices and farm income rose. A period of vigorous economic growth had begun. As the economy quickly grew, the U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, or gross national product, excluding the values of net income earned abroad, rose rapidly. This basic measure of national output increased by 116% from 1940 to 1944. During these same years, the total personal income of American workers jumped by more than 110%. Business income grew even faster, increasing by nearly 130%. In the New Deal period, the government assumed an active role in stimulating the economy, responsibility that was now expanded to meet wartime needs. The WPB successfully mobilized businesses supporting the war effort, fostering closer relationships between the government and large corporations. As also happened during World War I, a National War Labor Board, NWLB, was established to mobilize labor. The main role of the NWLB was to settle labor disputes before they disrupted war goods production. Immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, union leaders agreed to a no-strike pledge. 8 months later, the NWLB imposed limits on wage increases. The wage limits and no-strike pledge left labor leaders with negligible bargaining power. In exchange, the NWLB guaranteed unions that all new employees of companies with union contracts would automatically become union members, a policy that boosted union membership. Financing the war effort with taxes and bonds. During the war, government spending grew at an unprecedented amount. More than $175 billion worth of defense contracts were granted to businesses from 1940 to 1944. The government funded these contracts the same way it did during World War I, through taxes and borrowing. Taxes provided about 45% of the revenue needed to finance the war. The Revenue Act of 1942 increased individual and corporate income tax rates and more than tripled the number of individuals required to pay an income tax. To simplify tax collection, Congress devised a withholding system whereby employers portioned a certain amount from every paycheck to send directly to the government. This system of payroll taxes is still in place today. To simplify the tax, Congress devised a withholding system whereby employers portioned a certain amount from every paycheck to send directly to the government. This system of payroll taxes is still in place today. Borrowing largely provided the remainder of the money used to finance the war. The government borrowed from banks, from other financial institutions, and the American people by selling war savings bonds. As in World War I, war bonds simultaneously supplied the government with funds and provided a way for civilians to demonstrate their support for the war effort. Government agencies and private companies again created advertisements urging Americans to buy war bonds. Bond selling campaigns featured a variety of Americans from school children to glamorous celebrities. Government attempts to curb inflation and consumption. Inflation became a serious problem during the war. Although Americans had money to spend, the focus on military production reduced availability of consumer goods. Roosevelt explained the supply and demand issues in a fireside chat, saying, "You do not have to be a professor of mathematics or economics to see that if people with plenty of cash start bidding against each other for scarce goods, the price of those goods goes up." Congress delegated the responsibility of curbing inflation to the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, instituted price controls, or a system of legal restrictions on the prices charged for goods, which seemed successful. From 1940 to 1945, consumer prices increased only 35%, instead of doubling or tripling as some officials had feared. The OPA also rationed about 20 basic consumer products, including gasoline, tires, sugar, meats, processed foods. Consumers received monthly books of coupons that they gave to grocers when purchasing rationed foods. When they ran out of coupons, people were forced to wait until they received a new book the next month to make purchases. Drivers used a different ration book to buy gasoline. Americans complained about rationing, but most complied. This program successfully reduced overconsumption of scarce goods and ensured that everyone would have reasonable equal access to those products. Americans further aided the war effort in other ways. They formed carpools or rode bicycles to work, as well as recycled metals, paper, rubber, and other materials. Americans were told that one old shovel contained enough iron to make 4 hand grenades. Children collected much of the scrap materials and also peeled off the foil of cigarette packages and gum wrappers to roll them into balls for recycling. Families also planted victory gardens to grow food. In 1943, the more than 20 million gardens yielded 1/3 of all the vegetables eaten in the country that year. Victory gardens and recycling campaigns boosted war production and raised American morale on the home front because they understood they were making important contributions to the war effort. Section 2. American GIs go to war. Many young Americans left the comforts of home to join the military. While in the service, the government provided all their food and supplies, which were often labeled government-issued, or GI soldiers were given GI soap, GI socks, and a GI helmet and GI rifle. For that reason, they began referring to themselves as GI soldiers or government or GIs. The name stuck, and the men in the armed forces wore it proudly, assembling a fighting force. By 1940, over 16 million men between the ages of 21 and 35 had registered for the draft. Later registrations expanded the age restrictions to include men from 18 to 44. Most draftees were placed in the Army. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, draftees had swelled the Army's ranks from 300,000 to a force of more than 1.5 million troops. After Pearl Harbor, volunteers flooded military recruiting stations across the nation. They represented a broad range of Americans, from miners and mill workers to professors and politicians. By the war's end, nearly 6 million had enlisted, mostly in the Navy or Army Air Corps. For draftees and volunteers alike, the war offered an opportunity to demonstrate their patriotism by fighting for their country. Most willingly packed their bags and boarded buses and trains, not knowing whether they would ever return home. Immigrants and ethnic minorities viewed joining the military as an opportunity to show that they were truly Americans. Preparing the troops to fight. Draftees and recruits first reported to the Army Reception Center within a giant complex such as Fort Dix, New Jersey, or Fort Bragg, North Carolina. They had their first taste of the military life here, sleeping in barracks with no privacy and trading their civilian clothes for uniforms. They also listened to lectures and submitted to medical exams. The reception center's main goals was to determine whether each recruit should report to for training, decided by various aptitude tests. After a few weeks, most soldiers were sent to one of the many Army training camps scattered nationwide. Most of these young men had little experience with life outside of hometowns and suddenly found themselves thrown into unfamiliar environments with fellow soldiers from across the country. One GI from the Midwest recalled, "The first time I ever heard a New England accent was at Fort Benning, and the Southerner was an exotic creature to me." The trainer or drill instructor had as little as 8 weeks to prepare men for combat. These instructors were responsible for transforming civilians into hardened fighters. Trainees followed a strict routine. They woke up at 6 a.m., washed, dressed, ate, and had a long march to the training site at 8 a.m. For approximately the next 9 hours, they worked to become soldiers. Instruction included tent pitching, map reading, guard duty, sanitation, weapons care, and endless physical training. Later trainees participated in parachute jumping and live ammunition exercises, which required them to crawl through the dirt while real machine gun bullets whizzed above their heads. They marched back to camp in the evening, thoroughly exhausted. As one draftee wrote home to his parents in May of 1943, "I don't know whether I can stand to do what I have to do or not. I have to try it, though." Near the end of this basic training, he wrote, "Again, it was 106 today, and we are out drilling. We really do get hot, but I will tell you the truth, I have got so that I can stand it just as good as the next one. I sweat a lot more, but I go on like I was cool." This draftee had been transformed into a GI. The GI's war, hardships, and opportunities. Training was unable to fully ready GIs for combat, as few were even truly prepared for the intensity of the battlefield. The deafening blasts of artillery and grenades, the squeal and clatter of tanks on the move, and the billowing clouds of smoke combined to create a surreal atmosphere. There was also the element of fear. Soldiers knew that they could die at any moment, especially if they were crossing an open field or storming a beach under heavy enemy fire. New soldiers especially tended to freeze at the first sign of danger, and they encountered danger everywhere. Experienced soldiers learned to distinguish immediate dangers, such as the sound of an enemy tank or incoming artillery fire, from the din of war. Yet even battle-hardened veterans often felt heart-pounding sense of foreboding in the uncertainty of battle. Boredom sometimes became the enemy between battles. Soldiers with free time often felt homesick and lonely. So many men suppressed their sadness by writing letters. At night, they would attempt to put their thoughts and experiences into words for their friends and family. Receiving a letter from home was a major event. Under the strains of war, soldiers developed strong bonds of friendship. "The reason you storm the beaches is not patriotism or bravery," one rifleman recalled. "It was the sense of not wanting to fail your buddies." Those who survived the war often led significantly changed lives. Numerous soldiers returned physically, mentally, or emotionally wounded by their combat experiences. Yet, amid the horrors of war, many gained a greater appreciation for the American ideal of liberty and arrived home with a new sense of pride in themselves and their country. The internment of Japanese Americans, Section 3. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, there were around 150,000 Japanese Americans living in the Hawaiian Islands. Some people had questioned the loyalty of these islanders, even accusing them of helping plan the surprise attack. Fearing sabotage, the War Department recommended the mass evacuation of Japanese Americans from Hawaii, but the American military governor of Hawaii urged people to remain calm. Businesses on the island opposed evacuation, arguing that losing so many workers would ruin the island's economy. The press supported this position, making efforts to keep false rumors from circulating. As a result, nearly all Japanese Americans in Hawaii stayed there, dealing with fear of potential collaborators. On the U.S. mainland, concerns about disloyalty extended to the people of German or Italian ancestry because they were seen as potential collaborators, people who work with an enemy to undermine a nation's security. Shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt signed a proclamation declaring all German, Italian, and Japanese nationals or non-U.S. citizens to be enemy aliens. These orders affected more than 314,000 people of German ancestry, 690,000 people of Italian ancestry, and 47,000 people of Japanese ancestry. Every enemy alien had to register with the government and carry special identification cards. They had to turn over all firearms and cameras as well as shortwave radios, which could be used to send information to the enemy. They also needed a travel permit to go anywhere more than 5 miles from their homes. Government officials considered forcing all enemy aliens into camps, but the task of relocating every German and Italian alien presented enormous problems. Also, politically influential groups of German Americans and Italian Americans resisted such measures. Regardless, the government rounded up several thousand Germans and Italian aliens, sending them to internment camps in the middle of the country. An internment camp is a center for confining people who have been relocated for reasons of national security. Roosevelt authorizes the removal of Japanese Americans. In contrast, Americans of Japanese ancestry comprised a much smaller group with far less political power. They faced more radical discrimination than people of German or Italian ancestry because they were of non-white, non-European ancestry. Their social isolation also worked against them because they had not assimilated into American culture as seamlessly as other immigrant groups had. Japanese Americans kept largely to themselves in ethnic communities outside of the American mainstream. In addition, they lived mainly on the West Coast, where fear of Japanese invasion was strongest. Unlike in Hawaii, the mainland press, incited by the fear of accusing Japanese Americans of spying or of being more loyal to Japan than to the United States. These factors made it easier for the government to act against people of Japanese ancestry. In February of 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which declared that large military zones could be set up to exclude certain residents who were believed to be a threat to security. In March of 1942, the military used this executive order to launch a mass evacuation of people of Japanese ancestry from the Pacific Coast. Evacuees had only a few weeks to sell their homes and possessions. The order to move out and stay out applied not only to Japanese enemy aliens, but also to Japanese American citizens. Of the 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the mainland United States, 80,000 were native-born U.S. citizens and thus entitled to the same constitutional rights as all citizens. This was the main argument made by the Japanese American Fred Korematsu, who did not obey the evacuation order because he would have to leave his non-Japanese girlfriend. After 2 months of refusing to leave, Korematsu was arrested and convicted remaining in a restricted military area. Convicted with 4. I think it's a typo. Korematsu appealed the verdict, reaching the Supreme Court in the case Korematsu versus the United States. The court upheld his conviction on the grounds that a group's civil rights can be set aside in the time of war. 3 of the 9 justices dissented from this opinion, including Justice Robert H. Jackson, who expressed his fear that the court for all time has validated the principle of radical discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens. Life in the internment camps. More than 100,000 Japanese enemy aliens and Japanese American citizens were forced to evacuate. Families stored their belongings in a few pieces of luggage before leaving their homes. They first gathered at assembly centers, then in the summer of 1942 boarded trains for internment camps scattered throughout the western United States. They were given no indication regarding their destination. A typical camp, officially known as a relocation center, was located in a desert region far from any town. No houses were in sight, one internee recalled. No trees or anything green, only scrubby sagebrush and the occasional low cactus and mostly dry, baked earth. In these settings, internees endured extreme heat and in the summer and cold in the winter. The camps were constructed in a hurry. They consisted of row after row of barracks, as one surprised visitor remembered, with high barbed wire fences and machine gun towers all around. The single-story wooden barracks contained several one-room apartments furnished with cots, blankets, and bare light bulbs. Here, an entire family tried to make a home, sharing toilets with others in the barracks and using common bathing and dining facilities. The crowded condition led to frequent sanitation problems. Despite these hardships, most of the internees worked to make camp life more bearable. They built chairs and tables from scrap lumber, grew vegetables, and set up schools, libraries, hospitals, and newspaper offices. Women and the War. In early 1942, a popular song called Rosie the Riveter captured the spirit of the home front. All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for a victory. Rosie the Riveter by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb, 1942. Norman Rockwell, one of the country's most popular artists, painted his own version of Rosie for the cover of National Magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. 2 films centered on Rosie followed. The fictional Rosie the Riveter came to represent all the real women who reported to support the war effort. Rosie the Riveter. 2 films centered on Rosie followed. While other depictions of Rosie emerged over time, Norman Rockwell's painting of the Riveter gained the symbol its initial national attention. Rosie became the lasting symbol of female workers during World War II. Women in the armed forces first held positions as secretaries and clerks, but soon assumed greater responsibility. Here, a woman prepares for a military career alongside men at New York University. Around 18 million American women in total worked outside of the home during World War II. New opportunities for women in the workforce. The demand for workers skyrocketed as men left their jobs to serve in the armed forces. At first, industries hired unemployed men to fill these positions, but as war production soared, businesses and governments began to recruit women, and slogans like "the more women at work, the sooner we win." Nearly 2 million women worked in shipyards and other heavy industries, many toiling as riveters, and thousands of airplanes built during the war. Riveters operated in pairs, one woman using a heavy mechanical gun to shoot a rivet through a pair of metal sheets, while the other woman stood on the opposite side of to buck or flatten the rivet. The rivets held the metal sheets and the plane together. This physical labor increased women's self-confidence and independence and boosted their income. As one riveter explained, the war years had a tremendous impact on women. I know for myself, it was the first time I had a chance to get out of the kitchen and work in industry and make a few bucks. You came out to California, put on your pants, and took your lunch pail to do a man's job. This was the beginning of women's feeling that they could do something more. Sybil Lewis quoted in the home front during World War II, 1984. Sybil Lewis quoted in the home front, America during World War II, 1984. Hardships on the job and at home. Not everything about the workplace pleased women, however. They often encountered hostility on the job, especially in male-dominated industries. African American women faced the added stress of racial hostility. Women's wages also did not increase as much as men's. So in 1942, the NWLB ruled that women should receive equal pay for work of the same quality and quantity. Businesses often ignored this rule. Even labor unions, whose female memberships soared during the war, rarely challenged unfair wage rates. Most Most working women were married during the war and were still expected to maintain their family responsibilities because their husbands had gone off to the plant or office and then worked another full day's worth of cooking and cleaning and performing other domestic duties. By the end of the war, typical working women were over the age of 35. Relatively few of whom had young children at home. Those who did usually arranged for their children to stay with relatives or friends during the work day. Older children were often left to fend for themselves, so rates of juvenile delinquency and school truancy increased. Many teenage boys dropped out of school, lured by high-paying war production jobs. New opportunities for women in the military. Shortly after the war began, military leaders realized that women could do much of the clerical and secretarial work done by male soldiers, freeing men for combat duty. Congress agreed, passing legislation in 1942 that created a civilian support unit for the Army called the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. On the first day of registration, over 13,000 women volunteered to serve in this unit. The following year, the unit was granted military status and was renamed the Women's Army Corps, WWII. Women in the WWII became members of the military and underwent rigorous Army training. "If the guys can take it," one volunteer remarked, "so can I." In 1942, the Navy and Coast Guard established their own branches for women called Waves and Spares, respectively. Women in the armed forces quickly transitioned from clerical work to jobs as truck drivers, mechanics, radio operators, and air traffic controllers, and parachute riggers. A select few became pilots, mainly to ferry aircraft from factories to bases. However, only WWIIs served on the battlefield, working behind the lines in various support roles, including nursing. More than 200 American women died overseas as a result of enemy warfare. During the war, posters and magazines and ads encouraged women to fill jobs left by men who would join the armed forces. Millions of women answered the call, some as patriotic reasons, other for higher pay. Women made up 1/3 of the new workers hired during the war. African Americans fight for two victories. The United States fought in the name of democracy against Nazi Germany, which embraced an extreme form of racism founded on the idea of Aryan supremacy. However, racism was still a powerful force in American society. No one was more keenly aware of this hypocrisy than African Americans, whose participation in World War I had not helped their struggle against racism at home. As one black newspaper in the Chicago Defender asked, "Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't even have it here?" Other black leaders called for a battle against racism on two fronts, hoping all citizens would join the fight for a double victory, a victory for democracy both at home and abroad. This double V campaign forced many white Americans to rethink their attitudes towards black Americans. Confronting segregation in the military. When the draft was instituted in 1940, thousands of African Americans lined up to join the armed forces. More than 1 million served by the war's end, facing the hardships that began with their segregation in training camps. There they ate in separate mess halls from white troops and slept in separate barracks from them too. Camps had only a single movie theater, even forced black trainees to sit together in the last row. Early in the preparations for war, the Marines and Army Air Corps refused to accept any African Americans, while the Navy limited African Americans to duties like cooking, cleaning rooms, and shining shoes. One such messman aboard the USS Philadelphia sent a letter to a newspaper in hopes of discouraging other black men from joining the Navy. "All they would become," he wrote, "is seagoing bellhops, chambermaids, and dishwashers." The Army accepted black GIs but excluded them from combat. Instead, black GIs served in segregated units led by white officers, often working in construction, supply, or other service groups. Black leaders pressured the government to end military discrimination. Over time, the armed services gave black soldiers greater opportunity to engage in combat and become officers. The Army Air Corps established its first black combat unit in 1941, known as the Tuskegee Airmen. These pilots and their support crews proved that African Americans could handle even the most demanding assignments. They served mainly as bomber escorts, engaging in direct combat with German fighter planes. The Tuskegee Airmen amassed a reputation for skill and courage, shooting some 400 German air attackers out of the sky. They were the only fighter group to never lose a bomber to enemy planes. Seeking opportunity and equality on the home front. Black leaders also worked to improve conditions at home. In June of 1941, A. Philip Randolph heard of a powerful all-black railroad union, met with President Roosevelt at the White House. Before this meeting, the government had done little to confront discrimination in defense-related jobs. One steelmaker expressed the attitude of many in the defense industry when he said, "We have not had a Negro worker in 25 years and do not plan to start now." Roosevelt sympathized with black Americans, but the war in Europe had drawn his attention from civil rights until Randolph's visit. Randolph captured Roosevelt's attention by threatening to lead a massive march on Washington to protest discrimination. He promised that unless Roosevelt acted against discrimination, tens of thousands of African Americans would swarm the nation's capital on July 1st. His threat worked. On June 25th, 1941, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, outlawing discrimination by defense contractors. This executive order enabled nearly 1 million African Americans to work for defense industries during the war and triggered a migration of African Americans out of the rural South into industrial cities of the North and West. From 1940 to 1945, some 500,000 black Americans left the South, lured by higher-paying jobs. In the process, they escaped Jim Crow laws that legalized segregation and prevented many of them from voting. Yet, black Americans living in cities faced other hardships, including a lack of housing and social services, as well as ongoing racial discrimination. They also faced a white backlash. Race riots erupted in cities across the country as black migrants competed with white residents for housing and jobs. One of the worst riots occurred in Detroit, Michigan, in the summer of 1943. Minor incidents, including fistfights, swelled into a widespread conflict where mobs of rioters burned automobiles, looted stores, and engaged in bloody street battles. The riots resulted in the deaths of 25 blacks and 9 whites. Challenging racism at home. The WWII campaign's demand to end racism and segregation received support from several African American organizations. One group, the National Urban League, had been assisting black migrants since its establishment in 1910. The League opposed discrimination in defense plants, fought to integrate labor unions, and push federal officials to ensure equal opportunity for African Americans in housing and employment. Another group, the NAACP, had been fighting for equality since 1909 and sought racial justice through the courts. During the war, its membership soared. The National Urban League and NAACP did not want to undermine the war effort, so they avoided making strident demands. Another organization, the Congress of Racial Equality Corps, was more uncompromising. Founded in 1942, CORE encouraged confronting discrimination through nonviolent protest. Its efforts, along with the work of the NAACP and the National Urban League, helped the foundation of the post-war civil rights movement. In wartime America, the letter V commonly stood for Allied victory. In 1942, someone wrote in the Pittsburgh Courier, Black America's leading newspaper, suggesting that African Americans should seek victory not just abroad but also at home. On February 7th, the Courier printed the WWII emblem on its front page, sparking the beginning of the movement's campaign. Here, Americans show their support for the WWII campaign. Jewish Americans and the war. The war created unique hardships for Jewish Americans. They made the same sacrifices as other Americans, but also suffered from the knowledge that millions of Jews were being imprisoned and murdered in Europe. Furthermore, they were helpless against the slaughter. Growing alarm at Nazi persecution of Jews. American Jews began hearing reports of Jewish persecution in Nazi Germany shortly after Hitler took power in 1933. That year, the Nazi Party organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. 2 years later, the German parliament stripped Jews of their citizenship, forcing them to sell their property to non-Jews. Shortly after conquering Austria in March of 1938, Hitler began persecuting Austrian Jews. Tens of thousands fled. Then, on November 9th, 1938, the Nazis instigated a night of anti-Jewish rioting known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Mobs smashed the windows of thousands of Jewish-owned shops, burned nearly every Jewish synagogue in Germany, and killed more than 90 Jews. Another 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Kristallnacht was thoroughly covered by the American press. After Kristallnacht, thousands of German Jews wanted to flee the United States, but the 1924 National Origins Act severely limited the immigrants in one nation. Additionally, very few Americans wanted to allow a flood of immigrants into the country, especially during the Depression. Combined with widespread anti-Semitism, these factors led to incidents like the voyage of the steamship St. Louis. In 1939, the St. Louis carried 930 Jews from Germany across the Atlantic Ocean to Cuba. When Cuba refused to accept the refugees, the St. Louis steamed north along the Florida coast, attempting to dock in the United States. Roosevelt ignored pleas from the ship's passengers, and with food and water running low, the captain decided to return to Europe. A number of passengers disembarked in France, the Low Countries, or back in Germany. Many would later die in concentration camps. During the war, reports trickled out of Europe regarding the mass killings of Jews by Nazis, while accounts from Poland told of concentration camps using gas chambers to kill Jews. Few American news sources spread this information to the public, however, and when they did, the stories did not make headlines. Editors failed to tie these stories together and did not explain that they were evidence of Nazi campaign to exterminate European Jews. Jewish Americans urged the government to help Jews in Europe. Jewish Americans were painfully aware of the mass murder of European Jews. Many had relatives and friends in Europe, but felt helpless and were unable to save them. Some others boycotted German products, raising money for refugees, and held public demonstrations. In July of 1942, around 20,000 people gathered at Madison Square Garden in New York City to protest Nazi brutality, with similar rallies occurring in Chicago, Los Angeles, and other cities. Jews urged officials to send food packages to concentration camps and to conduct prisoner exchanges to free Jews. Jewish groups pleaded with legislators and the president to make immigration laws more lenient. Several factors prevented the government from offering refuge to victims of the Nazis. Polls showed that most Americans with views influenced by anti-Semitism were unwilling to admit large numbers of European Jews into the country. Even many American Jews worried that mass immigration might intensify anti-Semitic sentiment. Roosevelt also feared espionage and sabotage, as his advisors insisted that any group of Jewish refugees would include Nazi agents. By the end of 1942, the U.S. government was aware that Hitler was systematically slaughtering Jews. Still, it was not until 1944 that Roosevelt issued an executive order to create the War Refugee Board. This agency arranged for former Army camps in the United States. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the only Jew in Roosevelt's cabinet, later recalled the mission of the War Refugee Board. The stake was the Jewish population of Nazi-controlled Europe. The threat was the total obliteration. The hope was to get a few of them out. Jewish American GIs go to war. Like other Americans, Jews supported the war effort. More than 500,000 Jewish Americans served in the military, including half of all Jewish men aged 18 to 44. The opportunity to serve in the armed forces transformed the lives of Jewish American soldiers, many of whom had previously been unaware of life outside of their urban neighborhoods. As GIs, they often trained in the rural South before journeying overseas. Both experiences broadened their perspectives and immerse them in unfamiliar cultures. In the armed forces, Jewish American GIs often faced prejudice. After 2 years in the Marines, a frustrated corporal sent a letter to the editor of the Jewish magazine writing, "I am the only Jewish boy in this detachment. I am confronted with anti-Semitism on all sides." Other Jewish soldiers had a different experience. One of them affirmed their faith in their country and its ideals. In 1944, GI and future novelist Leon Uris wrote a letter to his father noting that he fought beside Catholics, Protestants, and Mormons, Indians, Irish, Italians, and Poles. Urus explained his experience, convinced him that it's not the religion we look at, but the man himself. Mexican Americans leave the fields for war work. During the war, many Mexican Americans faced discrimination in their everyday lives. Like African Americans, some questioned the purpose of joining the armed forces. Why fight for America, one soldier asked, when you have not been treated as an American? Despite such doubts, many Mexican Americans enlisted in the armed forces, while others left their traditional farm jobs on segregated urban neighborhoods to join the industrial workforce. These wartime challenges created new opportunities for Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans and Mexicans joined the war effort. Approximately 500,000 Mexican Americans served in the armed forces during World War II. One of their slogans was "All Americans All," suggesting that many viewed the war as an opportunity to prove their loyalty and to become part of the American mainstream. A higher proportion of Mexican Americans fought in combat units than any other ethnic group. Additionally, Mexican American soldiers suffered heavy casualties compared with other ethnic groups. They also received many combat awards. The Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded to 14 Texans, 5 of whom were Mexican American. One Mexican American leader summarized the social effects of the war in this way: "This war has shown those across the tracks that we all share the same problems. It has shown them what Mexican Americans will do, what responsibility he will take, what leadership qualities he will demonstrate. After this struggle, the status of Mexican Americans will be different." Manuel de Raza, quoted in Carlos Munoz Jr., Youth Identity Power and the Chicano Movement, 1989. GIs of Mexican ancestry served with distinction in World War II. Many received medals for bravery in combat. Some of these GIs were Mexican nationals or citizens of Mexico living in the United States. Service in the armed forces improved the chances of gaining U.S. citizenship. In June of 1943, U.S. sailors and Marines attacked young Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles, in part because their teenagers were wearing zoot suits. The police generally left the servicemen alone, arresting the Mexican Americans instead. Prejudice against Mexican Americans erupts in the Zoots. Before the war, discrimination had barred most Mexican Americans from many high-paying industrial jobs. The war and its labor shortages dramatically changed this. Thousands of Mexican Americans abandoned the rural agricultural lives and migrated to industrial centers to work in the defense industry. To replace Mexican American farm labor, the government looked south of the border. In August 1942, the United States and Mexico devised the Bracero program. Bracero is Spanish for manual labor. Under this program, Mexican citizens received short-term contracts to come to the United States to work. By 1944, about 120,000 Mexican braceros were completing farm labor in 21 states, while other Mexicans did maintenance work on Western railroads. Prejudice against Mexican Americans erupts in Zoot Suit riots. Mexican Americans in major cities lived apart from whites. Their barrios, or neighborhoods, were nearly self-sufficient, possessing their own shops, churches, and schools. Like many immigrant communities, barrios often developed in poor, rundown areas of the city, where crime rates were often high. The barrio of East Los Angeles during the war was no different. Mexican Americans there had little regular contact with white Americans, and relations between the two groups were hostile. In 1943, a full-scale riot erupted in the barrio due in part to the fashion fad known as the zoot suit. A zoot suit consists of a flat, broad-brimmed felt hat, a long suit coat with large shoulder pads, and baggy pants that flare at the knee. Many Mexican-American teenagers, or pachucos, in East Los Angeles began to dress in this flashy style, wearing their hair in the ducktail fashion, which was long in the back. While Americans tended to associate the zoot suit with Mexican-American street gang members, many of whom adopted the style. Thus, many white people viewed the flamboyant zoot suit as a symbol of lawlessness. Pachucos and servicemen from the local Navy base occasionally clashed in small-scale skirmishes, which would escalate into zoot suit riots in June of 1943. For several nights, mobs of sailors and Marines roamed the barrio streets, attacking not only gang members but also anyone wearing a zoot suit. They assaulted hundreds of pachucos and tore off their suits. Los Angeles police did little to stop the servicemen and arrested and jailed the victims instead. Meanwhile, newspapers incited mobs with headlines like "Zoot Suiters learned lessons in fights with servicemen." Military police finally intervened to end the violence. An investigative committee later determined that the main cause of the Zoot Suit riots were racial prejudice, police discrimination, and inflammatory press articles.